Week 15 already on its way tomorrow as we see the Chargers at the Las Vegas Raiders. But here's the top 30 wide receivers heading into Week 15. The first guy, Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers. Adams, he's been a stud all season. He's putting up big numbers. It seems like he scores a touchdown pretty much each game, is Adams. And like they say each and every week, him and Rodgers are the best quarterback to wide receiver tandem in all of pro football. And this week, another great matchup for Adams versus Carolina. He's going to do whatever he wants with that secondary, and I think he could go for 125, 150 yards and possibly 2 touchdowns in this game. So Adams, he's a stud. He'll be a top performer once again this week, and he's number 1. Number 2, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. DK Metcalf, he's been a stud all season, and this guy's Megatron 2.0 in my opinion. This week, he's got a middle-of-the-pack matchup versus the Washington football team. But Metcalf, he's a freak. He's an athlete. He makes a lot of big plays. And this week versus Washington, I think we could see him find the end zone here, is Metcalf, and have a good game. Once again, last week versus the Jets, they got off to a quick and early start, was the Seattle. And they never looked back, so they benched the starters by the end of the third quarter in that one. This one, I think the game will be a little more closer than that. And I think Metcalf, he could go for 100 total yards or more and find the end zone. Number 3, Tyreek Hill, the cheetah. Tyreek Hill, what a season it's been for him this year in fantasy. Only one game where he didn't reach double digits. And last week he had 2 more touchdowns to add to his resume. Even a rush one on an end around he had. So this guy, once he's in the open field, is Hill. No one's catching him. This week he's got a good matchup, in my opinion, versus the New Orleans Saints, where I could see him burn that secondary, especially on the fast track on the turf indoors in the Superdome. And I think Tyreek Hill has a huge game this week. Him and Mahomes, they're going to hook up on a couple deep ones in this ball game. So I got Hill at 3. Number 4, DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals. Last week, Hopkins finally broke out with a big game. And for whatever reason, Kyler Murray, he's been barely targeting Hopkins. Well, last week, Hopkins, a huge game, 9 catches, 136 yards in a pretty tough matchup it was versus the New York Giants. And this week versus Philly in Hopkins' home stadium. Hopefully Hopkins, he could do good here. Hopefully they could get the game going, is this team, and he could play well. So Hopkins is another home game. We'll see what he could do, and I think he'll have a good ball game in this one versus the Philadelphia Eagles, and I think he could find the end zone and possibly also reach the 100-yard mark. Number 5, Keenan of the Los Angeles Chargers. Keenan Allen, he's been great this season, but now minor injuries popped up this week in practice with the hamstring, and the ball game's tomorrow in Vegas. But Allen, he practiced. Him and Eckler have been banged up, but it looks like they're going to play. And Allen, I have him in one league. I need him to play. This is a must-win game, obviously. It's the semifinals. Everything goes. And hopefully Keenan Allen could have a huge ball game this week in Vegas, where I could see him go for a big game in this one, where he could get 100, 150 yards and possibly find the end zone. He's one of the best PPR receivers as well. So he's number 5. Number 6, Stephon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills. Last week in that second half versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was like a man possessed in that game. He finished the game with a 10-catch, 130 yards and a touchdown with Diggs. And Diggs, he's liking his new surroundings and his new football team. A great season for Diggs. He's doing well in Buffalo. Him and Josh Allen really getting things going. And this week, it's a pretty solid matchup at Denver. Denver's a pretty good team on defense at home, but it still don't matter to me. Stephon Diggs, he's a matchup problem for pretty much any corner in the NFL. And this week, I think he's going to have a good game once again, where he's going to find the end zone and have a good one. Number 7, A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. What a season for Brown it's been since he came off injury in week 4 or 5, I believe it was. He's finding the end zone each and every week. Last week, another huge game, 7 catches, 112 yards, and a touchdown for Brown. And this week, he's going to feast once again versus that Detroit Lion defense, who can't stop no one. We saw it last week to start the games. Adams on a quick slant just took it to the house for 50 yards. And Brown, he's an explosive receiver. He's a physicality problem for corners, and this guy's got breakaway speed as well. So A.J. Brown, I think he has a big one once again, and I got him at 7. Number 8, Robert Woods of the Los Angeles Rams. Woods last week, it was a down game for him on the most part. It was Cooper's Cup's week to have a good game. It seems like these two receivers switch off each week who's going to have a good game, but this week they're both going to have good games, I believe. Robert Woods has an amazing matchup versus the Jets coming to town, and Woods, I could see a double-digit reception game for him, and him reaching the 100-yard mark. This Jet defense, they can't stop no one. We saw last week David Moore and DK Metcalf have big games for Seattle, and this week I see Woods having a real big game. So you should be happy if you have Woods this week, especially in the semifinals versus the Jets. Number 9, Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. This guy, what a monster he is. Another big step he took this season, and last week he went over 100 yards and caught a touchdown, and that touchdown was thrown from Russell Gage to him versus the Chargers. This week, a pretty decent matchup versus Tampa Bay. This game, I could see a mini shootout between these both teams, and Calvin Ridley, he's a tough cover. Not many corners could stop him at all, and it seems like each and every week he gets 90 to 100 yards as Ridley. So I think I got him at a good spot here at number 9, and he has a good game. Number 10, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Jefferson, he's a stud. Last week he didn't have a good game, was Jefferson, but it was just a weird game in general versus Tampa Bay. This week he's got a hard matchup as well versus Chicago, but in their last meeting a few weeks ago on Monday Night Football, Justin Jefferson exploded for 8 catches and 135 yards, and in this game I think he'd have a similar type of performance in fantasy points where I could see him get 70, 80 yards and a touchdown, but it's still a tough matchup versus Chicago. But Jefferson, each and every week, he's a guy that could break out and have top 10 performances. So I got him at 10. Number 11 was staying in Minnesota with his teammate Adam Thielen. Thielen, his last matchup versus Chicago, he had 2 touchdowns and 45 yards in that game. And Thielen, he's been pretty decent this season. Last week again, though, him and Jefferson, it just wasn't a receiving type of game. Irv Smith Jr. and Dalvin Cook did most of the damage for the Viking offense. But this week versus the Bears, I think both these guys will have solid games like they did on that Monday night matchup in week 11, I believe it was, for these guys. So I got them at 10 and 11. Number 12, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. It was good to see Kupp last week find the end zone on a little bit of an out route versus the New England Patriots. And this week, another home game for Kupp. He's got an easy matchup versus the New York Jets, who pretty much can't stop anybody, or the Jets. And Kupp, I think he could go find the end zone in this one. He's going to get a bunch of catches. He's going to make a bunch of plays as Cooper Kupp. And like I said, he could have a huge fantasy game like he did versus Tampa Bay a few weeks ago, where he went for 35 fantasy points in that one. I could see an explosion here. Number 13, Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. Thomas, he's been picking it up of late. Him and Taysom Hill, they got some pretty decent rapport going. Thomas, a lot of turnaround and timing routes him and Hill have been doing. And Thomas, he's broken 100 yards twice now since Hill's been a starter. And this week he's got a good matchup versus Kansas City coming to town. Thomas, I don't think they have anyone in that secondary that's going to stop him. And Taysom Hill, he's going to rely on Thomas and Kamara, his 2 best players. Last week we saw that versus Philly when they were down 17-0 and almost pulled back the comeback victory, but they fell short. So Thomas, he's been playing good. He's been under the radar the last few weeks, and he's putting up good numbers. Obviously not first-round pick numbers where many people took him, but he's still doing solid, and he can help you win this week in the semifinals. Number 14, Julio Jones of the Atlanta Falcons. Julio all season, that hamstring injuries hampered him. But we'll see if he comes back this week versus Tampa Bay in a divisional game. The Falcons, they're obviously out of the playoff hunt, so it might not make sense for Julio Jones to start or play at all in this game. But if he does play, I got him at 14. He's still an explosive receiver, and he not 100%. He's a top 10 receiver most weeks is Julio Jones. In his last game we saw him, he did have 96 yards. And this week if he plays, he's at home. It's versus Tampa, and it's not a bad matchup, but we'll see if he plays. Number 15, Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears. A-Rob, he's been doing well since Mitch Trubisky got inserted back into the starting lineup, and this week he's got a pretty solid matchup in Minnesota. In their last meeting when Nick Foles started, though, he only had 6 catches for 43 yards, but Robinson, he found the end zone last week, and he had 29 fantasy points with a huge game. And this week versus Minnesota, I think he could get 15 to 20 fantasy points and have a good game, because him and Trubisky, they were on the same link. They're hitting and making plays, and that's what you want to see from Robinson. With Nick Foles, it was just short routes and pretty much no yards after catch, but at least Trubisky, he's getting the guys the ball over there in Chicago, and they're making plays. Number 16, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Mike Evans, he's been a big touchdown-dependent wide receiver this season for Tampa. And Tampa, they got so many weapons over there with Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Antonio Brown, Gronk. Even though Brown's been phased out, it looks like, of the offense. And Evans, last week, a mediocre game, 3 catches, 56 yards. So that's not going to get the job done. But this week, he versus a weak Atlanta Falcon team where receivers could have huge games. And I could see Evans possibly have his biggest game of the season this week. But I'm not going to rank him that high, because the inconsistencies have been there all season. When he don't score a touchdown, it seems like Evans can't even crack 50, 60 yards total in the game. So this week, I'll just have him at 16. Number 17, Deandre Johnson, another guy who's been up and down this season. He was showing good consistency, though, the last 3 weeks before he versus Buffalo last week. In Week 14 is Johnson. This week, though, he's got a great matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals. The Bengals, they really can't stop anybody. We saw Amari Cooper have a big ball game versus them last week, and I think Johnson, he could get back to his ways, getting 8 to 10 catches in this one with 70, 80 yards and possibly finding the end zone. So I think he's a decent start this week. He's a guy you should play, just because he had one bad game last week with 8 fantasy points. It was just a weird game, that Buffalo and Steelers game, where it was a defensive battle. But this week, I think Johnson, he'll be back on track and have a good game. Number 18, Terry McLaurin. Scary Terry. He's been scary to put in your fantasy lineups. The last few weeks, he's just not getting the ball for whatever reason. Now with Dwayne Haskins as the starter over there in Washington, that's going to be a big problem, I believe, for everybody in that Washington football team offense. And this week, it's a pretty good matchup versus Seattle, but Seattle's defense improved over the last few weeks, but they still give up the most fantasy points to wide receivers. So if Alex Smith's in there, I think Terry McLaurin can have a good game. If not, it's probably going to be a quiet game once again for Terry McLaurin and this Washington football team. So 18, I think, is a decent number where to put him, just with the bad performances he's had over the last few weeks. Number 19, T.Y. Hilton of the Indianapolis Colts. Hilton, he's had a resurrection now over the last month here for fantasy owners. And Hilton last week, another huge game, over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And now he versus Houston once again, that he torched a few weeks ago, and who he torches his whole career. So T.Y. Hilton, I could see him get 80, 90 yards in this one, find the end zone easy. This is an indoor game in Indy. They're back home. They're playing well, and they want to beat the Texans here in a game to get them to 10 victories is Indianapolis. So Hilton, he's been playing well for whatever reason. Him and Phillip Rivers now finally got it going together after they couldn't get anything going in the first 10 weeks of the season, it seemed. So I think I got Hilton having a decent game, and he's number 19. Number 20, Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. Cooper, he's been pretty good, man. He's only had 2 games where he didn't reach double-digit fantasy points this season, and that's when Ben DiNucci started versus the Philadelphia Eagles, and then when Dak Prescott got hurt in the game versus the Giants. And this week, he's got the San Francisco 49ers coming to town. Richard Sherman will most likely be on him in this game, and Sherman, he's not as elite as he was when he was in Seattle. He still can make plays and bother you on the defensive end. But Amari Cooper, he's been earning that contract this season. It seems like he scores a touchdown each and every week. He scored a touchdown in his last 2 games. And this week versus San Francisco, I could see him finding the end zone for the 3rd time. Just the only thing with Cooper, his yards haven't been great, but he's saving a lot of his fantasy days, finding the end zone, getting anywhere from 12 to 15 fantasy points, and that's solid. Number 21, Taijuan Lockheed of the Seattle Seahawks. Lockheed, I just don't know what's happened to him. he's done nothing pretty much the last few weeks. He only gets about 50 yards and 3 or 4 catches a game, it seems like. DK Metcalf, he's the total alpha receiver over there in Seattle now over the last few weeks. And Lockheed, he's got a decent matchup at Washington, but I just can't trust him to have a huge ball game. Obviously, if you don't have better options, you're going to play Lockheed because he still could have that breakout game out of nowhere like we saw versus Arizona early in the year where he had 15 catches for 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. So Lockheed, we'll see what he could do, but I just can't rank him in the top 20 anymore after having dud performances week after week now. But if he explodes this week, it wouldn't surprise me either. But I'm putting him here at 21. He's a number 2. It's a flex receiver this week for your fantasy teams. Number 22, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Godwin, it's been a weird season for him. Last season, he had the most fantasy points for wide receivers, but this year with Tom Brady, just so many weapons over there. Him and Brady not really on the same page as much, and I feel like Brady and all his receivers aren't really on the same page. So Godwin, he's a good PPR receiver, good possession guy, and we'll see what he could do this week at Atlanta. Atlanta gives up a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers, and maybe this is the week everything clicks for this Tampa Bay offense where Evans and Godwin could go for 100 yards. Who knows, but we'll see what happens. And I got him at 22. 23, Robbie Anderson. What a season for Robbie Anderson. And this guy's going to get paid once again this offseason because he's a free agent. He's the most reliable receiver over there in Carolina. And this is a game where the Panthers probably will be trailing most of the game like they did last week versus Carolina, especially versus Green Bay. Robbie Anderson, he's a PPR machine. He's only had 2 games where he didn't reach double-digit fantasy points. And this week, I think he's going to find the mark again versus Green Bay and have a big game. Number 24, Kenny Golladay. I don't know where Kenny Galladay's been, but he's still injured with the hip injury. I thought it would be a week or 2 injury, but it's turned into a 5 or 6 week injury. And the thing with Golladay, he's a great receiver and a good player for fantasy owners, but he just hasn't been healthy. He's hurt a lot of fantasy teams this season, but if you have him and you're this far into the season, that's a plus. And if you could get him back, you add a receiver with big upside to your lineup. But Golladay, we don't know if he's going to play, and if he does, it's a good matchup at Tennessee. Tennessee, a lot of teams pass on him, and a lot of receivers have had big games this year that give up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But if you don't play, it's going to be Marvin Jones and Marvin Hall and Mohamed Sanu and Amendola as the guys over there. But we'll see with Golladay. So if he plays, he's 24. If not, he's not on the list, obviously, and Marvin Jones will get bumped up into the top 30. Number 25, Juju Smith-Schuster of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Last week, Juju had a pretty good game. 6 catches, 55 yards versus the Buffalo Bills. And this week, he versus a Cincinnati team he usually has some good games against is Juju. This week, I think he could find the end zone. You know, Pittsburgh, they're reeling a little after losing 2 in a row, and they want to get that passing game right and that running game right as well. The last 2 weeks, it's been tough versus Washington and Buffalo for them. 2 games they probably thought they should have won, but they didn't. And this week, I think everything lines up good for this Pittsburgh offense, especially on Monday Night Football and especially versus a weak division opponent. So I think Juju has a good game this week. Number 26, his teammate, Chase Claypool. Claypool, the last few weeks, he's had some bust ball games with a 4-point and an 8-point fantasy day. And now this week at Cincinnati, like I just said about Juju, I think Claypool and the Steeler offense, everything gets right. Claypool, I could see him have a huge game this week where he could get up to 100 yards and find the end zone. That wouldn't surprise me at all with Claypool. Maybe he's hitting the rookie wall or whatever, but I think this week it's a bounce back for him and the Steelers. Number 27, Corey Davis of the Tennessee Titans. Davis here, he was a monster 2 weeks ago with 11 catches, 182 yards, but last week he came back down to earth versus Jacksonville. That's more of Derrick Henry having a huge game last week with 215 yards. They just kept feeding King Henry and A.J. Brown going over 100. So last week just wasn't the week for Davis. But I think this week versus Detroit, he could get 70 to 90 yards in this one and possibly find the end zone. It's a good matchup. Detroit, they can't stop nobody on defense, and we'll see what happens. Number 28, Brandon Cooks of the Houston Texans. He missed last week's ball game with injury, but it looks like he'll be back this week. And this week, it's a pretty tough matchup versus the Indianapolis Colts. Last time these teams met a few weeks ago, Brandon Cooks had 11.5 fantasy points. And this week versus Indy, I could see him get somewhere in that neighborhood once again. Cooks, he's been pretty solid as a third receiver or a flex option. And this week versus Indy, I think they're going to be trailing. And I could see this be a type of a shootout ball game as well, where they're just going to have to keep passing. And I could see if Cooks going for a decent game in this one, maybe 11 to 15 points. Number 29, Brandon Aiyuk of the San Francisco 49ers. Aiyuk, he had a big game last week, going over 100 yards with 10 catches and 119 yards. And this week, he's a great matchup, versus the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys, they can't stop anyone. Quarterbacks, they've been having field days, and receivers, they've been going for big yards. And this week, I think Aiyuk could crack that 100-yard barrier once again, and he's a perfect number 2 to 3 this week in your fantasy lineups, and especially with Deebo Samuel most likely out for the season. Ayuk's going to be the main target there. They're going to use him in a Deebo type of role where he's doing end arounds, he's doing wildcat formations, and he's making all types of different plays. So Brandon Aiyuk this week, I think it's another big week for him. And the 30th and final receiver that made the list this week in the wide receiver rankings is Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. He's been a good fantasy player the last few weeks, is Hollywood Brown, and he's found the end zone now 3 weeks in a row. He was horrible, where I said to drop him for weeks from like week 7 to 11, but he finally got it going. Last week he won the ball game pretty much for Baltimore with that 44-yard touchdown on that 4th and 5, and that's all it takes for Brown. We saw him last year with a lot of big plays, a lot of burn routes down the field where they can't catch him. So if this guy could catch a ball in the open field, he's good for taking it a long way to the end zone. So Hollywood Brown's the 30th and final receiver. And that's the top 30 wide receiver rankings heading into Week 15.